So, thank you everybody for the annual lecture of Shobha. Advise me to have voice first, I don't want. So, advise me to have voice first, so I don't want to say much on that. Anyway, Dr. Shobha Satyanath has done a great help to the Tibetan Linguistics Association of India for obliging us to deliver this series of lectures on social linguistics. So, I, on behalf of the Tibetan Linguistics Association, also my question. We express our gratitude. No part of time that will come later to Shobha Satyanath and to all who came here for lecture. So now I request Mr. Mano to give Professor Shobha Satyanath a and also the audience. So thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. This is the fifth and the last lecture of online lecture series on social linguistics delivered by Professor Shobha. Today, she is presenting on the topic, researching social linguistics data and methods. Now, I will read a short profile of Professor Shobha. Professor Shobha is former head Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi, has graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, USA. She studied social linguistics with Professors William Labo and Gillian Sankoff. She was a student of eminent professors like Lake Lister and George Cardona. Professor Shobha is a leading social linguistics of India and has done intensive research on various aspects of social linguistics, with special reference to Indian situation. She has done extensive study in social linguistics of multilingual, multicultural communities in India. The research has also focused on the outcomes of urban mobility and conduct on multi-ethnic, multi-dialectical settings, which has produced findings that are often at odds with the ones that have come from the Western social linguistics. Professor Shobha is a regular contributor of social linguistic journals like Journal of Social Linguistics, Journal of Asia Pacific Language Variation, and Journal of Language Conduct Exams. She has several important book chapters to her credits. She is the chief editor of the journal Asia Pacific Language Variation, published by John Benham. She is also a member of the steering committee of International Conference Series. I invite Professor Shobha to deliver her lecture. Over to Shobha.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Good morning from Delhi. Those who have joined me live on Zoom and those who are or would be watching on the YouTube later, I welcome you all to this final talk of the 5 talk series. I must say you've been a great audience and the organizers, you are the host now. Okay, I can do that now. All right, so you are able to see my screen now. Okay, very good. I'll just make this small. Okay, so good morning once again from Delhi. And I welcome you all to this final talk of the 5 talk series. And I must say you have been a great audience and organizers have been overly generous with their meticulous arrangements for making these talks possible on Zoom platform despite issues of logistics. Okay, so coming back to today's talk, how we research our speech communities. There are people who keep joining late. Admit. Okay. How we research our speech communities and how the rich data, comprehensive information generated on the speech community help us further our understanding of the multi-layered speech communities as we find in India is the topic of today's talk. And I must admit that it's much harder to give a talk on this topic and much simpler to run a live face-to-face workshop because it allows me to interact with the audience than generating a monologue. It is also hard because methodology cannot be learned in a single talk, nor is that the intention. Anyway, it's a practice and must be learned through practice alone. There are no shortcuts to this. The very first interviews that I ask my students to carry out are, as expected, often a failure. They are not able to carry out even a 15 minutes normal conversation on a single topic with a known friend. Only with practice and comprehensive planning, one gets better and better at it. Anyhow, it's not the purpose of this talk to try and train or provide a comprehensive introduction to the methodology, but to highlight some of the salient points. So, though the primary objective of social linguistics is researching a speech community, its methodology and theory have much wider implications and relevance across linguistics and many areas of humanities and social sciences more generally, when it comes to researching people and communities. This is because one of the reasons is that the social linguistics methodology draws from various disciplines and calls for suitable modifications of the method by the researcher. And the other reasons are why social sciences at large and humanities, some of them find it useful is because it brings objectivity to their research and it introduces them a method of gathering data and understanding the setting that they are researching. So there are three important threads of any such research enterprise. The first step is to specify the research objectives, what your research questions are. This in turn takes us to the next step, which is how do you carry out your research? This is where the data and methods come into the picture, and the two together determine the research base that you create for yourself to work on. So your data and methods play a vital role in determining the outcomes and how accountable those are. So generally, most linguists directly aim at language, and rightly so. Right? But the problem is that no language exists in a vacuum or in isolation of its speakers and their habitat. By choosing speech community, you get a better picture of both language and its structure, and often answers to the whys. Why does this language behave the way it does? This is very often not just a structural question alone, but there is more to it. Some more people. Okay. Further, and very often, there might be more than one language in one's linguistic repertoire and in the overall repertoire of a community. The habitat may be a village, a town, or a city, whether small or big. Each such habitat has its own history of settlement, its characteristics in terms of how people live, their local practices, and so on. So how you research is going to affect both the quality and the quantum of what you get and your understanding of both. One classic example is that many 19th century linguists, mostly anthropologists, or early 20th century, including Sapir, who were studying American Indian languages, reported that in these communities, men speak one way and women another. They were right. Such an observation could come only because of their indulgence with the communities. By employing anthropological methods with their linguistic research. However, their understanding could not capture the full reality, hence such conclusions. Several decades later, two studies appeared in two different parts of the subcontinent, one in Southwest China and another one in Nagaland, India. Both sociolinguistic studies. The first one was an outsider's view, whereas the second one was carried out by a cultural insider. It became clear that such observations were an outcome of the clan-based structures of the communities and their specific matrimonial practices. However, the two sets of communities had significant differences, and two sociolinguistic studies contributed immensely to the understanding of language in these communities, which could have been easily missed otherwise. Likewise, if you follow only the qualitative approach, you might miss out on the details of the patterns and the internal working. So your methods affect the discovery outcomes. I'm not saying qualitative analysis is bad. It actually depends upon what sort of data you have. If you have a smaller set of data, but adequate, and you can use qualitative approach. In fact, that is the first step. But if you have a huge archive, then you have to bring in quantitative methods eventually. Okay, so take another example. Whether you are exploring simple vowels or diphthongs, you might satisfy yourself by just discovering their phonemic status, maybe some allophonic variants. But you may completely overlook the relations among vowels and their distribution of the variants. You may also miss out the variable relationships. Even a large data set can be wasted if your methodology is not meticulous. This requires taking into consideration every single occurrence in which the relevant vowel or its variants, etc., occur or are expected to occur or not occur. The evidence and outcomes should not be assumed in advance. If you could objectively code every single token, then you will be able to discover the real structural patterns which could slip out of your attention otherwise. So qualitative, as I said, is not a bad word, but not utilizing the full potential of database harms the analysis, leading to half-baked results. Very often we read grammars or available grammatical descriptions, and we often find discrepancies across descriptions. And very often these are outcomes of data and methodology. So data is not just a set of utterances, a list of sentences or words, etc., or a pre-designed questionnaire. So they are also not responses to a fixed pre-designed questionnaire. Your objectives determine what your data is or should be. And this is an important step, right? So after initial data collection and analysis, you may be able to decide if you need any further data and what kind of data. I often follow this step. So what constitutes data? There is no a priori definition of data. That's the first thing that we must remember. And this must be determined by objectives of the study or the research goals. And that would allow in turn to think of or evolve suitably or adapt a set of methods. So for example, the New York Departmental Store study made use of anonymous surveys and utilized smaller set of observations from as many store employees as possible in 3 stores. That is because the objective of that study was not really carry out a full-scale study, but to understand like a pilot, whether the hypothesis that Leboff had in mind is worthwhile examining or not. And for that, this kind of methodology served his intention very well. And only after his hypothesis was proved based on this smaller set of data that he carried out a much larger study in New York City later. Likewise, Sharma carried out a study on vowels in Delhi, and she wanted to test vowels in various possible contexts because such studies were not available before that. So she created an exhaustive word list using dictionaries and also making use of the everyday commonly used words, and then evolved a methodology around that. So she designed reasoning tasks, but they were interspersed with conversations, with filler words embedded in larger frames. That's what Bhattacharya did. She was studying S voicing in Delhi English. So she used not only English words, but she also used English Hindi code mixed words and lots of other filler words to actually test what was going on. So these are kind of small examples, right? Some people are still joining. We'll end in 3 minutes. Just a minute, please. Because I have to admit, people, I sometimes lose track of what I'm doing. Okay, so in general, you need large amount of good quality recorded speech data from a representative sample and know who your speakers are. So there is no definition of large. Once again, this depends on your objectives. Okay, and I must admit that we might be logged out in about 9 minutes. That's all right, but we'll continue. When this logs us out, we log in back again. All right. Okay. So talking about data again, social linguistic sources is primary data from everyday normal casual interactions that speakers indulge in. One way to tap this resource is to observe how people talk when not being observed. But you can't go on anonymously observing people. You need large amount of good quality recorded speech data from a representative sample. This requires a methodology which comes by training. One of the key methods is face-to-face, what we call social linguistics interviews, which are based on the principle of how people talk when they are not being observed. Taking steps to minimize the effect of the observer's presence is a principle that guides its method of making people talk. The method of social linguistics interviewing is different from the media interviews, as the power relationship between the two is reversed and the goals are very different. It is the interviewee that the information flows from and not to. Also, the burden of triggering a normal conversation and keep it going is on the interviewer, not on the persons being interviewed. This method is unique and is remarkably different from all other methods called field methods in India and elsewhere. And see Lebov 81 for a concise description of this method. So you can't research a speech community unless you educate yourself first by researching, gathering, and reading as much information as is available through a variety of written sources. Its history, its demography, population, socioeconomic composition, businesses, etc. That helps you decide the locations that you want to choose. And if we miss that one out, we miss out a whole lot of information. So it's not enough that I want to study Bangla spoken in Calcutta or something. You also need to know what kind of city Calcutta is and its history, and what kind of people from what regions have been settling down. If you don't know that, then you would not know how many local dialectal varieties exist, what kind of communities exist. And if you just pick up your data from somebody that you call a so-called native speaker of Bangla, you might miss out a whole lot of information, right? Okay, so the first principle here is know your speech community, and that involves readings on the speech community. 2, locating sites for observation. And here we generally make use of judgment samples, but representing most characteristics of the city that we are interested in. Next comes approaching the speech community. This is where the initial crucial contacts come. And it's not an easy job to make an entry into the speech community. It requires, again, knowledge of the methodology. And then once we succeed in making the initial contacts, then we build on those contacts using, one way is that you use networks of contacts as you develop familiarity in the neighborhood. One of the methods that we have all used, and it has been successful. And then equally important is that you have to maintain those contacts. So you aim at households rather than individuals as far as possible. It's equally important that you explain your project and seek information for recording and for ensuring confidentiality. Why would people let you record? And why would people talk to you? I mean, they are absolute strangers to you, and you are an absolute stranger to them. But human psychology is such that everyone wants to share their story. And this is what the methodology does. It provides you a way to tap into that. Okay. And interviewing in home settings in the presence of family members has proved to be the most effective method in social linguistics in Indian settings and when researching Asian diaspora. So interview as many members of the family as possible, depending upon the objectives. I recommend interviewing all generations available in a family. And in Asian settings, it pays to take family as a unit. Then comes basically making people talk. So we call it conversational modules for interviews. So the question is, what interests people? What kind of things different people generally talk about? If you happen to be in any gathering, in a wedding or something like that, and you see people are constantly talking to each other, they're constantly chatting. And if you are a good, keen observer and listener, you might want to just observe what is it that people are talking about. So these are the clues. We can't help ourselves. We can't really keep ourselves quiet. We like to chat. We are chattering classes. So keeping this in mind, one needs to develop different modules. And under each module, you should have a battery of ready to deliver questions, which are formulated using the local speech practices. So what's a conversational module? It's a group of questions focusing on a specific topic. For instance, it could be marriage practices, school time memories, theft, civil life, hardships, fights, dreams, dating, film, neighborhood life, whatever works, right? Designed keeping in view various age groups and a variety of people. These must be locally relevant and questions should be culturally appropriate. So in every culture, it may not be appropriate to talk about death. In some cultures, it might be a taboo. Now, India has changed a lot. There was a time when we couldn't have talked about dating or premarital sex, etc. But now my students say it's perfectly all right to use such modules. And they have been using them, okay? So a primary purpose is to trigger normal conversation, narratives of personal life experiences, and covering a large range of styles, if any, in solo and in group settings, which will provide you an opportunity to observe everyday casual speech behavior in number of settings. Often, any discussion on language, stereotypes, attitudes towards other groups also emerge from such interviews only. Modules are an essential resource that an interviewer draws upon for the purpose of conducting an interview and improvises on it as the interviews progress. What works with one person or in one setting may not necessarily work with another. So through a battery of questions and a module and a variety of modules, one is able to sense the interest of the speaker. So sometimes you just try out and you can quickly run through those modules that you may have, and you can easily figure out what interests people. So here are some examples of possible modules like local history of the neighborhood, community, village, town, whatever you are researching. And I think this is one of the useful modules. It also gives you time to warm up. The initial part of the interview is always warming up before you feel free, comfortable, and they're able to talk about themselves. Family history, another useful module, regardless of what you get, right? Again, it helps in warming up. So when I was working in Guyana, I asked everyone who came first in their family from India, and that was a big hit. I thought it might be a sensitive issue, no, but that was a big hit, and it gave me the insider's view into the history of mobility into Guyana. What we have is an outsider's view that has been available in print, okay? Some people are still joining. All right, less than a minute, so it doesn't matter. Marriage practices works pretty well. I asked someone, how did you meet your husband? And it works in many cases. There would be a giggle, there would be a laughter, but then people like to talk about. And remember, with the older speakers, they have past to look back into. For younger speakers, it's the present and the future. Courtship and dating, belief systems, death, taboos, supernatural powers. In many cultures, people do like to talk about it. Okay, I can do that now. Okay, so we were talking about examples of modules. And we talked about local history of the neighborhood, community, village, town, family history. It's a good way of knowing the place. And it provides you good modules as a initial warming up sessions. Other things which have worked is marriage practices, particularly with older people, and also otherwise courtship and dating with younger people, belief systems, death. In some cultures, it's perfectly all right to talk about this, and you get to hear a lot about practices in individual communities. Taboos, supernatural powers. This is one module which, if it clicks very well. In Guyana, it was a hit. There were many other communities. So you might want to ask something like, some people say that there are ghosts, and some people say we don't believe in ghosts. But is there anyone in your family who ever saw something like that? And it clicks at times. So in a place like Guyana, there are lots and lots of such stories, right? And it clicks very well. Okay, festivals, detailed descriptions of how you do it, cuisine, family and discipline. This is like raising children, school days memories, films, sports, fights, travel. Some people like to talk about travel. Education and literacy practices, that's more for the sake of information. Civic services, safety, thefts, accidents, hardships. The lower you go down into the socioeconomic strata, you find that the hardships is something that clicks with people, and not so much about cuisine and festivals, etc. Community services and functions, weaving, fishing, agriculture, depending upon what community you are in. Child rearing with young mothers, it works very well. Native medicine practices, personal life experiences, drinking, fights, disputes, pilgrimage, religion, travel, relations with other groups. This is where comes the attitudes and stereotypes. They often emerge when you're talking to people. So we don't really need a questionnaire specifically designed to elicit attitudes and stereotypes. This should be woven within your interviews modules. And though we generally talk about it, we don't talk about directly about language, but issues relating to language also come, but they should come towards the end. But about relations with other groups, sometimes they figure as very, very prominent with some people. Language use, so whatever I have put here, I put an asterisk, right? Asterisk. Terrorism and political issues. 1 second. Yeah. Terrorism and political issues are something that needs to be avoided. One shouldn't get into these things. So I put double asterisks to say that, this needs to be avoided. And wherever I've put single asterisk, that means they come towards the end of your interview. So as I said, there is no shortcut to this, as it is hard to make people talk. Right? Many inexperienced interviewers who are overconfident, they've formulating questions without preparation tend to exhibit a bookish lexicon and grammar and show the influence of a survey methodology. They often run out of questions and may not know how to keep the conversation going meaningfully. And it may so happen that they would be talking more rather than making the other person talk. So I always tell, do participate in the conversation, but don't get interviewed and come back. You know what I'm saying? So questions formulated without preparation tend to be quite long, with many restarts or false starts. And question formulation generally moves from general to more direct. So for example, you might begin asking something like, is it safe for girls to go around in the night on their own around here? And then say, you never had any trouble, or did you have ever trouble? Okay. And more direct questions like, did you ever get blamed for something you didn't do? But these have to be, I'm giving you in English for the sake of the larger audience, but depending upon where you are, what language you are researching, you have to formulate them in the local language and are ready to deliver. So it's very important that you're familiar with the local vernacular practices, because that's how people talk. If you want to really get down to one-on-one interpersonal talks, conversations, right? And as I said, you can ask, like, some people believe in ghosts, some don't, but did anyone in your family ever experienced something like that? And in our experience, it has worked in many cases. Then there are also don'ts. Okay, another don't is that you don't read out those questions, right? You have to make modules, a battery of questions, you have to rehearse them. And you can't really keep the notebook in front of you and say, okay, I'm going to read out question number 1, question number 2. Okay, let's see question number 3. No, you don't do that because I said it's not a media interview. These are the modules designed to make people talk. And people talk only when they come across a topic that interests them. And it's not an interview of the sort that you have to exhaust the battery, right? Once you trigger a conversation, the best thing would be to be a keen listener, allow the speaker to complete that topic, give enough time, and maybe he or she will move on to another topic tangentially away from your module. That would be the best thing to happen, okay? So some of the don'ts that I've listed here include the following. One is avoid direct questions where you ask people to fill out something. I personally feel it's a no-no. 2, avoid direct questions on personal details. The relevant details often emerge if you have the patience and the right strategy. So you don't really have to note down exact age in terms of years and months, etc., right? They often emerge when people talk about their school time memories and other things. Such information often show up and you can guess. Then you can maybe verify later on. And avoid being intrusive. Do not interrupt when somebody's talking. Do not read questions and do not be nosy. That's very important. It's not our intention to get the specific kind of information. It is basically, so it's not the content that matters, but it's like what people are saying. Is their talk, the conversation, the speech that matters. Contents really don't matter, okay? And very important that you place yourself in a humble position, in a position of lower authority than the person being interviewed, because you're a knowledge seeker. You're trying to gain something, you're trying to learn something that the speaker knows, but you don't. Avoid interrupting your speaker in the middle. It's not very important that you have to talk. So show yourself instead as a keen listener, provide more than enough time to complete a topic, and also allow the speaker to move on to another one. Only when you know that there is a silence is not getting anywhere and you need to provide a trigger, that you pitch in. And you don't participate in a conversation by loudly saying something. Instead, nod your head. Otherwise, your recording will capture all you're saying, and that might just overlap with the other person is saying, with what the other person is saying. And coming to very small children, they should be recorded with the help of mother and by engaging them in play with friends whenever possible. They are the hardest one to talk to. They are also over inquisitive. So their attention would always be going into your bag, into your recorder, into your gadgets, whatever you have, rather than focusing on what you want them to do. So young speakers and older children do well in groups than when interviewed alone. Okay. Then interviews are often supplemented by a variety of other tasks like reading tasks, self-report tasks, subjective reaction tasks of various kinds, then anonymous observations of linguistic behavior in public places, off-the-record observations, language use on media, radio, television, written sources, past records, right? So again, so you can't simply rely on the interview in order to be sure that you need to know how people talk in a speech community. Then only you would know what you're getting on your on record versus what people do. Maybe same, maybe different, but it allows you to understand how people talk when they are talking to their own people, or when the conversation shifts towards in-group members versus towards you. That you need to recognize. It's not so much about authenticity, but it's about understanding the verbal repertoire. What kind of speech styles or speech varieties are there, which form part of it. Here, I want to say something. People who often research and go with the agenda of that they will research an endangered community, or they assume that some varieties are disappearing, some dialects are disappearing under the influence of standard, or smaller languages are disappearing under the influence of the bigger languages, they are often wrong. because they don't realize their focus is on one language alone. But that's precisely where they go wrong if they are researching anywhere in Asia or in the subcontinent, because very often the verbal repertoires comprise many speech varieties, and the so-called mother tongue networks. Mother tongue is a problematic term when we are in a multilingual setup, but regardless. But the so-called mother tongue networks, which are confined to home and community, are often not part of the public review. So they are hidden from you. You have to have appropriate strategies and methodologies to trigger those. And anything that you get on record or you ask people, reported behavior, that has to be supplemented by actual observations, right? So coming here to ethics, right? I think I said about don'ts, right? Yeah. You don't record anything without permission. As I said, right in the early stages, you introduce yourself, your project, though you don't talk about language, but there are ways, it's not that you're lying, but there are ways to get around that. And introduce your recorder and seek their permission for recording and justify why you want to record. So you say, well, I can probably note down whatever you tell me, but by the time I've spoken to a few others, I'll be all mixed up. And it's a good practice to actually play back what you have recorded to them. Okay. And another important part of the ethical practice is protection of anonymity. This you have to abide by, and also you have to ensure speakers of that their identities, etc., will be kept anonymous. So after you get your recordings, etc., you anonymize. You create pseudonyms for every character, every person who is there, whom you have recorded. Of course, you keep the details with you, but you create pseudonyms for the people, for the neighborhood, so that, you don't have to create a pseudonym for the city or the town or the village, but you don't have to disclose the identity of the families or of the people. I have not put it on this one, I'm sorry. And then it's equally important that you monitor your recordings. That means while recording, sometimes it may happen that you are recording. See, recording is not simply a one press button story. It's not. There are many things. Recording is a very technical process. So you need to have if possible, a professional recorder. If that is not available, you need to have a very good microphone that can compensate for an ordinary recorder. And when I say professional, you need to look into the technical specifications, whether it covers the human range, audio range or not, and what sort of frequencies or noises it has the capability to filter out, etc. And you need to practice from various distances. And you need to see whether it records people right in front of you or to the left, to the right, since we are often in a family settings, you should make sure that if you keep your recorder in the middle, even if you're hooking the small lavalier microphone to the person who's talking, it should be able to capture other people. I'm not saying you have multiple channel recordings, multiple this and that, but even using simple gadgets, you should be able to do. Right? So we need to adjust the volumes, input volumes. It should neither be over recording, nor it should be under recording. And there are ways to figure that out, right? If it is under recording, if you find yourself upping the volume, turning the volume up and up, then you know it's an under recording. And if the signal just blasts, and there's a distortion, then it's an over recording. So you have to practice all those things beforehand. And when the recording is on, you have to periodically monitor to ensure that it's actually being recorded. It may happen that you waste a very nice interview only to realize that it didn't record anything. It has happened. Mishaps happens with every single field worker. Sometimes you over record over an existing one, and you end up wiping that one. Okay. So it's very important that you monitor recordings periodically in a way that it doesn't really disrupt. And equally important is to make several backups and every day keep field notes. You may observe many things when the interview is on and when you enter the family, after the interview, when you are still chit-chatting with the family, and and so many, or when you are there somebody gets up to answer a phone call, or somebody knocks at the door, somebody receives, so many things happen. Another person, family member turns in, or a friend turns in, and people turn. So you should keep your field notes on a regular basis. And equally important is that you listen to your recordings every day and you transcribe on a daily basis. Label your recordings with dates and details of the participants, as you may forget then later on. So these are all part of your notes. And then, of course, extracting relevant data for analysis. One way is that we transcribe the entire recording, depending upon the time and the logistics. The other method is that we only do we only extract the relevant parts of it. For example, if you're looking for a particular variable, so you only extract those parts, those sentences, or those 2 or 3 sentences in which that token is occurring, and sufficient information around that, right? And then, of course, you combine these with findings data collected using other methods. So there is always a master corpus, remember, plus smaller corpus with select data that you actually use for your analysis purposes. So far I've focused only on the data, but a key to the successful fieldwork lies in developing or producing an understanding of the speech community itself. And only then one can sample a speech community, gather data meaningfully, and interpret data and make sense of how people use language as a resource for everyday socialization and interaction. It is well known that no two speech communities across the globe are alike. While standard methodologies have been successfully extended to locations beyond the West, every speech community presents newer dimensions of research, contributing insights into how these communities are researched in terms of data, metadata, and method, and importantly, how the findings are understood and explained with reference to the data. So that's why I wrote there, everything about the speech community. You start with that, then data and methods, and then comes the interpretation. So as an example, right, when we talk about social differentiation of speech, people often ask, well, which factors we should balance our data for? That would vary from speech community to speech community and what your interests are. But let's say if you're interested in caste-based social differentiation of speech, there has been some discussion on that in my past talks also. At first, you have to have an understanding of the caste itself in the place where you are studying it, what has been written on caste in India, and that every caste category is multisectarian. Why caste becomes such a contentious issue is because it is very unique to India and in a handful of places where you find Indian influences or Indian diaspora. But you can't really learn much about it. So whatever we know, so caste has been misunderstood because of the understanding of the European scholars. And caste itself has evolved and it has been changing over time. It has not remained constant, right? Okay. All right. So it's very important to know that every caste category is multi-sectarian. So there is no one single Brahmin or non-Brahmin caste binary, for instance. The residential patterns with reference to caste, social distances, or its absence among different caste group members, and what role does caste play in people's life are all important considerations. Only then you would be able to evolve a methodology where caste is studied together with other social traits of the speakers and the community. This is where the early caste surveys in South went wrong. Caste was taken as a given, a simple binary of Brahmin and non-Brahmin. Above all, no direct observations were made of interactions within and across caste groups. So one has to know that there has been much social mobility in India throughout the history, across castes. So we know a lot of people became Kshatriyas, but India has produced all kinds. There have been kings coming from all castes. There have been Brahmin kings, Kshatriya kings, Shudra kings, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about Koch or we talk about Vishnupriya, they all became Kshatriyas, right? And so on and so forth. So without theorizing, this also applies to communities. When you are researching in a place like northeastern part of India, communities have changed their identities, they have moved, they have changed their names, they have merged sometimes with other groups. And there is very often a split among groups when a particular village reaches a certain level of population, right? Which is probably what gives rise to a lot of village-based dialects. Anyway, so without theorizing caste, understanding is present and historical character, one can't take a social category as given and static. And this is where most people go wrong when they are doing this kind of a social linguistics research or talking about social differentiation of speech. Moreover, even where caste affiliations exist, they may not always be relevant as far as language is concerned. So I think in the one of the talks, somebody said, but people do identify themselves. Yes, we have multiple identities, but language need not index or mirror every identity. That's very important to understand. Many times people tell me, oh, Muslims there speak like this. And I said, are you sure? Yeah, yeah. What if, can you hear someone without seeing their face or knowing them? Can you tell somebody is a Muslim? Oh, yes, yes. And we know precisely those things do not turn out to be true when we conduct experiments. When I was doing work in Guyana, people talked so much about the other community and they said, oh yeah, Afro-Guyanese talk like this, and Afro-Guyanese would tell me Indo-Guyanese talk like this. Oh yeah, we can tell. But actually there was a perfect ambiguity. Their responses were perfectly random, 50-50, right? So very often these are folk beliefs, popular stereotypes. We should not be driven by them. This is where objectivity comes in. Objectivity comes in because first you have a methodology which allows you to observe and have that on record. The other one is that you are silently observing as to what's going on. So I remember when my husband was at Hampi University, they organized a field trip for the first time to observe a jatra on Mailara. It's a community. And we had a 3-day workshop that we ran before that. And then I was part of that team. And there were lots and lots, about 1 lakh people or so travel. No accidents, no such untoward incidents happen. And there are a lot of things which are going on around. So you could be sitting on your bus stops, you could be bus stops, you could be just walking through the people, and you can observe so much, right? And so they found that methodology very, very useful. It was a turning point for them, actually. Okay, so each caste is a community with its own history and importance, right? And the same goes for class. It has to be computed using locally relevant socioeconomic factors on a scale, and then only constructing an index out of it. So we can't make guesses, oh yeah, I know this is an upper class, this is a middle class. No, that you cannot do. And moreover, social class really has gone haywire in the Indian context. Gender is even more complex, and so is age and aging, because meaning and the importance associated with different age bands varies across cultures. So these are socially dynamic and locally relevant categories, and without a proper prior understanding of these, the outcomes would be erroneous, if not disastrous. One second, please. Yeah. So Cherukunam village in Kerala, where Sunny carried out her research, is home to several social castes, Hindu castes, and religious groups like the various Christian groups. While most of the groups are patrilineal, one group is also matrilineal. Sunny was aware of the caste dialect surveys that were available when she undertook her work. Likewise, Bihar, where Kumar carried out his work, that presents a semi-urban setting with different dynamics, with the presence of many more castes, empowered women, and much mobility among youth, both girls and boys. Each caste is engaged in multiple professions, and that makes a difference. So if caste intersected with gender in Cherukunam, it intersected with profession in Bihar. In both places, residences are organized in terms of caste communities, but this density does not necessarily cause social distance. This is where I think once Pandit pointed out, Gumfers revised his understanding. And he says that, I'm not going to quote that one. Similarly, in Gujarat, Pandit showed that various other dimensions such as rural, urban, level of education, and various other factors interacted with caste. So the above findings have many fallouts for us, particularly for the future field workers. One needs to balance the sample in terms of various relevant social factors instead of studying caste by itself. Excuse me. Likewise, one would end up overestimating the role of caste, as many surveys in the 1960s did. Two, given the presence of significant interaction among social factors, a mixed factor group effect model is likely to work better than a model based on random group effects. I'm talking about the multivariate analysis and quantitative methodology. Finally, caste and social factors are not equivalent to each other. Neither caste nor socioeconomic class on their own are sufficient to index linguistic differentiation in the Indian context. So when the early anthropologists poured into India in the 60s, when the South Asia programs were set up across American universities, one thing that they were interested in hugely was caste. And this is where the caste surveys began. Okay, in contrast, Laskar 2011 reported the presence of 3 castes among the Bishnupriyas in the rural setting that she was studying, but she did not find any apparent relevance of caste sociolinguistically for her project. She instead reported on bilingual setting that itself turned out to be salient. Moving on to another social factor, clan. So there are only 2 sociolinguistic studies, as I said, that have specifically focused on clan as a sociolinguistic variable. These suggest that clan-based societies do not form a single prototype, despite displaying some important commonalities such as exogamy. The same that I was explaining for social class. So we can't take, some people think, oh, Lebov study had social class, so we should take social class and we should replicate somehow these studies. No, it just may not work at all for Indian settings, right? So you don't, so this, particularly when it comes to social factor, they are very, very localized, because this is where the differences across the speech communities come in. So we can't take them and extrapose them elsewhere and saying, oh, it's a standardized method and the standardized social practice. No, they actually don't. They are not. They don't work like that. Okay, so one study comes from the Sui community of Southwest China, and the other comes from Angamis of Nagaland. Sui villages are based on clan lines. This was reported in James Stanford, numerous studies by him. So Sui villages are based on clan lines, where it's going to end in 10 minutes. We wouldn't worry about it. So once the system logs us out, please log back, okay? I'll ignore this. Sui villages are based on clan lines. Women marry across clans and settle down in husband's village. Post-marriage, they continue to speak their own village clan dialects. Among the Angamis, a village itself might be a multi-clan village, as is the case with Kohima village, which Sokri studied. Women do not change their ways of talking post-marriage and do not accommodate to husband's clan dialect in both the studies. Separation of clan identities of 2 parents plays an important social role in maintaining exogamy and to prevent marrying among the close skins. This has important linguistic consequences as well. And in fact, you find that the clan practices vary across communities. In the Masas, for example, I think for 7 generations, they maintain this distinct identities of the 2 parents, because for 7 generations, they cannot marry in the same clan. After that, I think it's allowed. So don't assume that all clan communities would be alike. That's the point I'm trying to make here. So one of the things that the studies found was that despite the geographic proximity, clan lactal differences are maintained. 2, interclan marriages give rise to a household where 2 parents speak differently. The apparently gender differences are an outcome of the practice of exogamous marriages, not what the 19th century and the early 20th century anthropologists reported. Men speak one way, women speak another way, and that's the way it is. But the real reason is this exogamous marriages. Okay. Third, One important difference between the Suis of Southwest China and the Angamis of India is that Sui children are expected to speak father's clan dialect. As a result, children who first learn their mother's dialect, they have to transition to the father's dialect. Not doing so results in public shame. And this creates a scenario where married women speak in multiple village dialects to others. Children, adults, and unmarried girls speak the village dialect, and every marriage linguistically diversifies the village. In contrast, excuse me, among the Angamis, there is no such expectation or a social mandate that children must follow father's clan dialect. As a consequence, Angami children grow up amid diverse linguistic input they receive from the two parents and other relatives, and their speech is modeled on a mixed pattern. Unlike Sui villages, Kohima village presents further complexities with the ongoing social changes. One such change is the weakening of the traditional strict clan exogamy in marriages. So as a result, same clan marriages are also happening now, though people still can't marry among the same family surnames. So Bello cannot marry, for example. In fact, much of the Indian system in the past has observed village-based exogamy in marriages. Brides are rarely brought from the same village. It actually did not happen. And this practice was also transported to Guyana by the Indians who went to Guyana. I think somebody wrote about this way back, an anthropologist, that how village-based exogamy is continuing in Guyana. Okay. So all this adds to the linguistic complexity, which has implications for how we sample a speech community organized along clan lines. And this has implications for any structural analysis we produce of the language itself. So Sokri, through her various studies, at least two, drew data from a sample, balancing and representing various possible marriage combinations. She then coded data for family background, recorded all relevant social information like father's clan, mother's clan, specific intra-clan family background, and among other factors. If she hadn't done that, she would have missed out on the phonology of Angami itself. And we know that before that, there were at least a few handful of grammars of Angami which pre-existed. Okay, 5 more minutes to go. So despite studies often showing an intimate relationship between social structure and linguistic differentiation, for example, social stratification of linguistic variables along class, gender, etc., linguistic changes can also obscure such a relationship, suggesting that the two may also largely operate independent of each other, despite revealing relationships at times at other levels. As reported in Sokri, the ongoing linguistic changes in this case, increase in the use of palatal variants in two variables, are diffusing across clans in Kohima village, thereby obfuscating the very linguistic indexicality of clan membership. Please recall I said that there are 4 clans in Kohima village, which can be termed as alveolar clans versus palatal clans, depending upon whether they use more alveolars or predominantly palatals, right? This is what I mean. So if palatals are spreading across clans, then it's going to blur the distinction between the palatal and the alveolar clans, and thereby affecting blurring the identity itself, right? Linguistically, at least. So this may very well be the result of the growing contact in schools, churches, or simply weakening of the traditional clan structure. Even otherwise, there is no social isolation among the clans. Clan structure plays an important role in marriages and in continuing a clan genealogy. Sokri's work of 2016 and the work in progress shows evidence of both stable variation, which reveals one's clan identity, as well as changes in progress, which blur such distinction, right? Further, one of the changes have their origins in the mixed clan families, and has spread to the same clan families where children have no exposure to palatal variants within the family, suggesting outbound nature of family learning, right? And in the other case, I think when we find that yeah, that also operates in mixed clan, but it's a men-led change. So we can't assume that once we find, so within the same study, we find between two generations, it's a change led by women, and in the subsequent generation, it's a change which is furthered by men. Now we move on to more of multidialectal, multilingual speech communities. Examples of linguistically multi-layered speech communities, whether multidialectal or multilingual, are common across India, cutting across language families. Such realities are often dismissed as exhibiting standard non-standard divide and are further interpreted in terms of power and dominance framework. Moreover, modern standards arose in different nations in different contexts and carry different functional values for its speakers than what has been understood in the Western context, like prestige and power or association with class. Rajan Mistri's portrayal of complexities of standard language in South Africa and the bubble repertoire is completely at odds with Radgill's model of social and regional variation, as pointed out by Mistry himself. Anyway, I have argued that relationships between standard and colloquial, written and spoken, languages with versus without official status are much more egalitarian in traditionally multilingual settings such as India than in the Western nations, where the relationship between standard and non-standard is hierarchical. Those of you who are interested, please refer to a special issue of Asia Pacific language variation. It is titled as What's the Standard About Standards? And that brings a lot of interesting insights from across Asia Pacific. And it leads you to various new findings which you had not even imagined. Okay. So the important difference is often, right? So this important difference about the relationship between the standard, non-standards, languages with or without official status, etc., is often ignored and even less understood by scholars in India because they are blindly extending a Western model. According to Pandit, until the advent of British, the concept of a dominant language was unfamiliar to India. It is English that for the first time, according to him, disrupts the equilibrium. It was then. But since then, a lot of changes have occurred. So, but even this fear did not turn out to be true, as we have shown in our own research on English in India, with English becoming one of the local regional languages. Yeah, I can do that now. Share. All right. Okay. So I was talking about Pandit, and Pandit talks about, some more people are joining, okay. Pandit talks about additive nature of bilingualism that existed in India. And he says that played an important role in sustaining multilingual practices in India. In fact, he quotes a very nice example from the past, of course. So he says that there is a language of ritual and religion, language of court and elite, the language of literature and language of home and neighborhood. So a Gujarati Brahmin in the 16th century may speak colloquial Gujarati at home, perform his religious practices in colloquial Sanskrit, may use Persian in court, and compose poetry in Braj. Such diglossic or polyglossic situations where different languages and dialects were selected for different purposes maintained the diversity of languages and probably prevented the rise of one dominant language in the country. Yes, he was right for those times. However, these days, home domains are no longer isolated from the presence of other languages. Instead, each domain is being diversified by the presence of multiple languages, forging a new relationship with other languages. I think I drew an example to this effect last time from English in India. Pratibha Bhattacharya paints a picture of her early experience during fieldwork on Bengali in Calcutta. The Western Bengali of Calcutta, being associated with the state of Bengal as its official language, is widely recognized as the standard Bengali among numerous Bengali regional varieties spoken across West Bengal, Tripura, and parts of Assam. The urbanization and westward mobility towards West Bengal, what I mean is, since the 19th century has made speech of Calcutta highly multidialectal. Bhattacharya demonstrates how the multidialectal speech of Calcutta plays out in the choice of variants of sh, having palatal and alveolar variants. That means sh and sa, and ch with plosive and aspirate, spirant variants like ch and sa. Remembering her first visit to a family, she reports, all the adult members, except the 20 years old son, use the palatal variants, that means sh and ch, alone with her, while at the same time, they switch to the corresponding local regional variants among themselves, right in her presence. Despite having spent nearly 10 generations in Calcutta, the family has not lost some of the highly marked regional variants like Sa of Cha. So regional variant Sa, that comes from the palatal Cha, and very commonly attested beyond West Bengal, particularly more on the eastern side. Most casual interactions in Calcutta are marked by Sa-Sh variation in general, though there are a few categorical speakers of Sh as well. At least they seem to be. In several subjective reaction tasks that were conducted, listeners hear themselves using the variable patterns. There is no over-reporting of the standard variants either, suggesting a neutral value attached to the standard as well as the non-standard variants. Even though the use of palatal sibilant has become synonymous with Bengali, and in popular perception, it is seen as associated with education as well, the perception task carried out to judge the social meaning did not match with the popular imaging of Shah. The speech specimens with all Shah were judged as associated with high school or college education, whereas the rest of the specimens with varying degrees of Shah showed ambiguity in judgment. The moral of the story is that one needs to be careful about imagining a direct correlation between popular stereotypes and actual practices, and assuming a direct relationship between the standard variants and prestige. Even though the focus of the study was on Bengali, Bengali is not the only language spoken in Calcutta. The study was carried out being aware of the dialectal diversity that was discovered quickly in the early days, and especially during the pilot surveys. So it was carried out being aware of the dialectal diversity that is present elsewhere as well as in Calcutta itself. And this is not an isolated example. So she focused on family as a unit and drew data from families with longer history in Calcutta and where several generations were living together. And this allowed her to map the developments over a period of more than 100 years. A similar example involving use of an external norm comes from Day in her study of Bengali, spoken in Silchar, Assam. Bengali is spoken in West Bengal, parts of Assam and Tripura, and also elsewhere, where it also enjoys the status of the state official language. Western Bengali of Calcutta is, however, considered as the standard variety across India. And speakers of non-Western Bengali routinely switch between the two varieties. They use their own regional dialect among themselves and switch to the standard when speaking to speakers from dialect backgrounds different from their own. When asked how many varieties of Bengali are spoken in Silchar, they reported Kolkati, referring to the Bengali spoken in Calcutta, that is the capital city of West Bengal. Silkelu, mix of Kolkati and Silchar Bengali, and the local Silchar Bengali. She provided, I think, some of these categories. In this case too, there is no higher evaluation of the standard, and the relationship between the two varieties is horizontal. However, if one is not careful, one can easily end up concluding that the non-Western varieties of Bengali are stigmatized and carry low prestige, and maybe they are on their way out. The standard variety in day-to-day context serves as the common one, despite it is the written variety and used in institutional context. The Silchar Bengali has a merger of ch and sa, of pa, pa and fa, and of j and za, but many speakers, interestingly, are capable of making a distinction when speaking in standard Bengali. Likewise, a Western Bengali speaker based in Delhi, when interacting with another Bengali speaker, may tend to merge sa and sha, but would make a distinction when talking to a non-Bengali speaker. So these are not accommodations, as one might anticipate, but reflect elaborate repertoires of competence in multiple speech varieties, registers, and languages. My next example is from Ao, spoken in a small town of Mokokchung in Nagaland, with a population of meager 60,000, as reported in 2001. Among two of the principal dialects of Ao, there are actually four dialects. Chungli is the written one. It is taught in schools and is considered the standard variety of Ao. The other dialect, Mungsen, is just the spoken dialect. The two are mutually intelligible to a large extent, but vary in many phonetic, phonological, lexical, and morphosyntactic properties. Both the dialects are spoken in the town. The popular perception is that Mungsen is dying out because it is not written, and it does not enjoy the official status and is taught in schools. Imchen studied the local variation by drawing a sample comprising 16 families, amounting to 56 speakers, representing same dialect, that means Chungli Chungli and Mungsen Mungsen marriages, and mixed dialect, Chungli Mungsen, Mungsen Chungli marriages. She interviewed both the parents, migrants from villages who had spent more than 20 years in town, as well as children who were locally born. There are many remarkable inferences that can be drawn from her study. Most speakers in Mokokchung town are bidialectal, as both the dialects are used everywhere, including the workplace and the market. The speakers reported to have learned the other dialect from family, friends, neighbors, and churches. Each group also reported to have a greater number of speakers than the other variety. When asked which dialect accommodates more, both groups reported that it is Mungsen that accommodates more. This is the only reported finding that matches with the popular perception. Furthermore, a reanalysis of the findings, as in Satyanath 2018, suggests that there is mutual accommodation instead of the one-way influence triggered in favor of the standard. Another tricky part of the fieldwork was the choice of the dialect that Imchen should use. She had many choices, such as use the same dialect as that of the speaker, or the standard, or her own dialect. Though part of the answer depends on the objectives of one's study, in a context setting like this, it could be tricky. The study was interested in the outcomes of urbanization and contact. So she instead asked the speaker what dialect they would like to converse in. And I think this worked best for her, as she probably avoided being seen as a member of a particular group, which otherwise might have triggered excessive use of a particular dialect. This approach allowed her to navigate her way across families from various backgrounds and was able to observe the presence and use of bidialectalism. The outcomes reported in these studies, whether Bhattacharya or Imchen, are also different from the ones often reported in the case studies of urban Koine, where the marked regional variants are often eliminated or are seen as eliminated under the pressure of the standard. Such research methodology has important implications for researching in India, which is marked by the presence of more than one language or speech variety, and especially for those who believe that bilingualism and bidialectalism kill diversity. Whether or not a language is losing its speakers is a conclusion that should emerge only from the research, along with the evidence and reasons behind it, and not from a preconceived notion or a folk belief. The size or the official status are not the key diagnostics of the nature of a language. I draw now example from English. English in India has long been assumed and researched as a language of the elite. Reasons for such an assumption are partly the association of English with the colonizers and partly the apparent disparity in exposure to English created by or contributed by different kinds of schools. In terms of methodology, this has made many researchers draw their data exclusively from the affluent locales of, for instance, Delhi, focusing on those who were educated in the more exclusive public schools of Delhi, believing that English is a language of the elite. However, English has seen tremendous growth and has spread across the social spectrum in both urban and rural areas. Its usage may not be the same from one place to the other, and yet this is the widespread reality. From being a language for specific purposes, English has transformed into a language of socialization. It has acquired a new relationship with the local languages, where both have mutually intruded into each other's domains, resulting in mutual hybridization. Given this social reality, Sharma drew her data from across the social spectrum, representing different kinds of schools. She was investigating vowel reduction and changes taking place in other vowels. Her findings suggest that English in Delhi is undergoing changes through innovations in its vowels. Examples includes lowering of kit vowels like enough, enough, goat, north, merger, unmerging of the earlier goat and north, and lowering of goat. This variation is significantly conditioned by internal factors. As suggested in her study, the new variants are used across speakers regardless of their social and educational background. Most importantly, the innovations are emerging from below and are being led by those who have had vernacular or bilingual schooling. The new forms are used by everyone. This is contrary to the popular belief of English as a language of the elites alone. Furthermore, the social meanings of the variants are not determined by the external normative English, nor is one's home language a significant factor in understanding variation. The conservative forms are not evaluated more positively either. This is contrary to the practice of researching English used by only those with private school background and living in posh areas of South Delhi alone. English in India is one among several languages and especially not and socially not of much consequence. Excuse me. In a survey of the fast food restaurants that my students routinely carried out as part of their social linguistics classes, reported that English is the language often used for placing orders. Once an order is placed, the person at the counter then calls out and passes on the message to the other workers in Hindi, which can be heard. The guests too return to their tables and may switch to Hindi for socialization, leaving English behind. Such findings are made possible because of a change in methodology, absence of a priori assumptions, direct observations of language use, which all come from speech community-based approaches of social linguistics. Those who simply refuse to grow out of the models of the 60s and models of applied linguistics research English either as a second language or as a deficient replica of some external authentic system or as a continuation of founder dialects, none of which capture the dynamic and the changing reality of English in India. It is important to note that my experience with English in Guyana, where I studied the Indo-Guyanese community, whose ancestors migrated during the 1831 and 1920, is no different from the present India. English in Guyana coexists with the vernacular popularly labeled as Creole. That's also English. The usage of the two varieties in the same discourse is conditioned by similar relationships as observed across India. However, given its history, it's ethnically a mixed society with Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese as two principal groups. It is socially stratified by race and class, which is not surprising given its history and the story of urbanization. I selected two neighborhoods, one representing a higher upper class neighborhood and the other mixed representing all classes. Despite I was a total stranger, my ethnic Indian membership played an important role in gaining in-group membership and access into the speech community. One of the important module that was used was who came first from India. In fact, we have used family history across all our studies, which has proved to be extremely useful. Okay. So what I have shared with you so far is essentially the basics or the key points of the classic standard social linguistics methodology, which involves sampling of a speech community, but generally makes use of a judgment sample. Social linguistics interviews plus participant observations plus various other tasks, right? And it makes use of a well-age graded sample, socially representative sample reflecting the innate character of the city depending upon the focus. Of course, no study can capture it all, so one has to make a decision accordingly. Increasingly, those who come from documentation projects and have large archives bring slightly different kind of data. In some cases, the data is elicited through pictures and stories. Such stories also may not be as representative either. Yet, size of the archive from lesser reported communities makes them valuable and serves as a groundwork for further research. At times, there is very little or no quantitative analysis either, but increasingly, a great interaction is happening between those who work on documentation projects and the social linguists. So documentationists are increasingly incorporating variationist methods of variation. Many scholars elsewhere, where social linguistics traditions are not particularly strong, but where there is a growing interest in the subject, we find online surveys or innovative methods to recruit participants and relying on experimental elicitation techniques with robust quantitative methods. We often find this happening in parts of China and in Pacific. So lessons to be learned is that one size does not fit all. Knowledge of social linguistics research methodology can have significant implications for researching our speech communities, not only for social linguistics, but also for documentation purposes or any other subdiscipline of linguistics and literature, applied issues, language technology, and building speech corpora in the most efficient manner. In fact, one of the reasons why language technology has suffered in India is because we lacked speech corporas, and the ones who had it, they were never incorporated into those projects. So despite having the expertise of building speech corpora, I don't think that our expertise were ever utilized or we were ever even approached. This methodology and practice also constitute important first steps in the direction of digital humanities within the field of linguistics and across social sciences in India. Western social linguistics, specifically American social linguistics, have had remarkable influence on social linguistics research practices worldwide. While some findings have been widely replicated worldwide, it is also becoming clear that one needs to be mindful of the internal dynamics that the non-Western speech communities offer. These settings, for instance, may offer a different language ideology, multilingual repertoires affecting the nature of choices, relationship between the variants, and ways of producing social meaning. Likewise, social class may not be the only or the most important factor in understanding social organization of these communities, and that social classes may also work differently where applicable. So coming to the last part of my talk, what I have basically said is that no two speech communities are exactly alike. Through various examples I've shown, multilingual, multidialectal communities of India present their own social dynamics and challenges. Drawing on a cross-section of examples from various settings of India, I showed what some of those challenges are. And an awareness of these could have important ramifications for how we research and understand a speech community. I summarize some of these points below. One, expanded repertoires. Many of our communities are highly multicultural and multilingual, and which in turn contributes to their expansive verbal repertoires, whether multilingual, multidialectal, or both. Such expansive repertoires are the result of both historic and more recent mobilities, contact, dense family community networks that support continuation of regional varieties beyond their places of origin, though not necessarily without change, and various functions and fluid identities these varieties might serve. This may have a number of important fallouts, such as A, it widens the scope of linguistic variation and the feature pool available to speakers in a community to draw upon. The choices could be lexical, phonological, morphological, morphosyntactic, and may also involve switching between varieties themselves. B, a language may acquire a different role and identity when placed in a different context than what it holds elsewhere. C, even when the focus is on a single language, it is important that the language be viewed not in isolation, but in the context of totality of verbal repertoire in which it is embedded. Next, I talked about the social meaning of linguistic variation, where I said that the multicultural repertoires can be sustained only when the relations among them are multidimensional. In contrast, Western communities often work with a monolingual model and two varieties broadly construed as standard and non-standard. The two varieties form a hierarchical relationship with standard at the top of a socioeconomic and political hierarchy and vernaculars at the bottom. This in turn influences the particular social meanings the speakers associate with them. This particular unidimensional relationship should not be a priori assumed everywhere else. Third, I talked about English in India, and I said the above point, which I just mentioned, is equally applicable to the study of English. One needs to be aware that the English, despite its colonial past, may not retain the external Western norm in newer locations. It may have acquired newer role and relationship with the local languages, becoming one among them. A deficit model may easily overlook the local innovations and may ignore the totality of the emerging verbal repertoires in which English is embedded. Realizing that this is a distinct variety, shaped by contact and change, can prevent many preconceived notions and unwarranted conclusions overly influencing the analysis. Then I talked about language of the interview, and I drew upon the example from Mokokchung, which is a bidialectal town with the presence of two varieties, Mungsan and Jungli. And an important and tricky part of the fieldwork was the choice of the dialect that the field worker should use. And as I mentioned earlier, Im Chen had many choices. She could use the same dialect as that of the speaker, or the standard, or her own dialect. But instead, she asked the speakers what dialect they would like to converse in. This worked best for her as she probably avoided being seen as a member of a particular group, which otherwise might have triggered excessive use of a dialect. And it's a bidialectal town. This approach allowed her to navigate her way across families from various backgrounds and was able to observe the presence and use of bidialectalism in two generations. Her findings also under the influence of Chungli, which is identified as the standard G. Now, this is a big danger and a caution for the scholars in India. In the case of Guyana too, despite not being fluent in the local vernacular, I intersperse my talk with local vernacular. This issue is particularly relevant where multiple varieties define the verbal repertoire. Then I talked about the ethnographic approaches, extended observations, and importance of family as a unit. Social linguistics methodology has long advocated a combination of approaches, including participant observations, experiments, and a thorough understanding of the speech community prior to beginning the fieldwork. It is also true that every fieldworker has to evolve and suitably modify his or her approach and evaluate his or her relationship with the community as a field worker. In the Indian context, interviews conducted in the presence of family members provide greater insights into the actual linguistic practices. Then I mentioned the salience of social factors other than social class, and I said the social cultural diversity of India is equally reflected in its social cultural composition. For instance, it may be necessary to rethink the coding of social or socioeconomic class or study its components in isolation, such as occupation, education, etc., independently. There may also be local factors such as caste and clan, which may prove more salient either independently or in combination with other social factors in some communities. Finally, our expectations about the interplay of gender and language may not hold in societies where gender roles differ from those previously studied. To conclude, I've shown that the existing variationist models and their methodology for approaching a speech community can be fruitfully extended to the study of India. The success, however, depends on realizing the important ways in which these communities, whether larger or smaller, might differ from each other and from the more extensively studied Western communities. These differences require an approach which is more sensitive to the local realities and avoids applying preconceptions in a top-down manner. It is hoped that the above discussion in today's talk will help the current and future generation of researchers in India. The discussions of specific research sites also reflect on the nature of social linguistics data and metadata of importance of social linguistic research. That's it from me. Thank you for listening to me. So we are open for discussion, comments, observations, clarifications. And if we run out of time, feel free to log back again.
So if anybody has any question,
You may have questions later, perhaps. Even a clarification based on your own fieldwork experiences, if you like. In any case, if you want to learn about the methodology, you'll have to read several chapters, especially Lebov, and several dissertations, which contain a detailed chapter on the field workers' experiences and the methodology employed. But as I said, without practice, you can't learn it. And it's a good idea to include some components of this methodology, no matter what your research goals are. Okay, if there are no questions or comments, I thank you all. There are 4 more minutes to go. Maybe we can just stop it here.
Yeah, ma'am. Once again, thank you. Thank you for all the paper. Thank you for the the presentations as well. Especially this field, especially the social linguistic field, a lot like not really everyone focuses as of now, but very rarely people focuses. People like those who are interested in language development work and community related work, tribal upliftment work, they'll be more keen in paying attention to this kind of sessions as well. And by the way, it was a great thing for us to go through all these sessions, even almost 5-6 sessions that we had to go through here, and it was a blessed time anyway. So I just want to have a question. For example, in Indian situations, do we have anyone specifically focusing on researching Indian minority languages, especially on the perspective of social linguistic? Do you have any idea on that? Who really focuses on social linguistic researchers such as this?
Okay, I think many of the examples that I cited, for example, from Nagaland, they're really, really small communities, right? So Kohima village has just a population of like 15,000 people. And Mokongchung town has like 60,000 people. Vishnu Priyas are total 60,000 across India. So, so communities are really small. And we must remember when we talk about smaller communities or big communities that in a linguistically dense situation, we cannot have communities with equal number of speakers. And this disparity arises not because of discrimination. This disparity arises because we have to draw a distinction between the agrarian communities or those which came in the fold of which adopted agriculture early on. It's only the agrarian communities with surplus and being tied to land that they were able to multiply their populations. Other communities which followed a more itinerant ways of life, nomadic ways of life, those who were mobile, they obviously couldn't have maintained a very large community. Plus, they kept on splitting them, and mortality must have been very high. So the rate of population growth is normal in those communities too, and yet they remain small because they live in cluster of villages. So the number of villages must be multiplying, right? So these are some of the things that we need to be aware of. So it's not small or big. People also move, then they become a smaller community somewhere else, right? So if Delhi houses all the 200 languages, you can imagine what's happening. So everybody, for example, might be speaking Hindi. But in addition to that, they may or may not be practicing their own. But I said home networks are very often hidden from public review. And reported behaviors alone are not enough to rely on what's going on. So they can tell you there are examples of a foreign team researching in Karwal and reported grandparents don't speak Garhwali, parents don't speak Garhwali, so Garhwali is dead. But that was a wrong observation because Garhwali is spoken across the community. For a long time, there was this propaganda that Kashmiri is dying, no one speaks it. But in my experiences that I used to travel from southern end of the country to the northeasternmost end of the country in train over a journey of 5 days, I would meet so many Kashmiri families talking in Kashmiri vibrantly, right? So it takes something more than what we take for granted. That's what, okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So continuing further with that, so there are lots and lots of communities around the globe, smaller communities that are being researched. So across Pacific, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and many, many other locations in Northern Australia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, which are being researched, focusing using such methods, right? And they're very successful in understanding such communities. So I was giving you an example of Angami, though grammars exist, right, on Angami. But the way Angami was researched by Suokri, focusing on Kohima village as the unit, that provided many, many more interesting findings on, and that also opens up a very important debate about about peltalization, which has remained an unresolved problem in the history of Tibeto-Burman. Matisov also comments on that. So you need to understand how the communities are organized in order to understand how the innovations travel. And it's not enough to pick up Angami and say, by doing this, by getting few educated people or a bunch of people, we can get everything on Angami. No, we actually miss out a whole lot about language because for a simple reason that languages cannot exist beyond people and habitat. Their natural habitat is a community, which is where languages exist. Without that, you will not get a holistic picture of language. That's the whole point of social linguistics, that linguistics cannot be asocial. Otherwise, you have inadequate empirical databases. Many people may have large corpuses of sentences and structures, but again, they're drawn in an inadequate manner. So your database remains inadequate. Any other comment or question before we run out of the time?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for even commenting on the Kedwali thing. So recently, we as a research team, we had a survey in the Kedwali and also in Kumon region there in Uttarakhand. So that was an extensive survey for almost 75 days. So we had a social linguistic research on 13 varieties of Kumon and almost 9 varieties of Gedwali in the region. So potentially we could find out 3 individual languages among the varieties, which is not closely related to the other one. And even Kumon, we have 7 independent languages, which is not really closely related to the neighboring languages as well. So a final question, and would like to have a comment from you is, how far the multilingualism aspect affecting the minority community, especially we're talking about the communities with, in even the Northeast, we have 1,000 people speaking a separate dialect or separate language. So how far the effect of multilingualism actually impacting in the life of saving saving the life of languages in India. So having that comment, especially one more thing, recently we had a survey in Maharashtra region, a language, actually it is a cluster language called as Koli varieties. So they have many varieties within them. So they live in the coastal land of India, especially in the side of Maharashtra, Gujarat, and towards Goa. So what we find is when the people don't of the same community, if they live in coastal region towards Maharashtra side, and they will be coming under SC privileges, the SC and ST privileges. So whereas the situation there in Karnataka side, they are not in the SC, ST, but rather they will be in the OBC. So in order to have the privileges, to have the government policies privileges, people are changing their identity. And hence their language identity also being slowly changed because of the infos that coming from within their family or within their community. So even this multilingualism aspect is also coming, promising in a way, job opportunities, other opportunities, education opportunities. So what is your intake on the effect of multilingualism in terms of language preservation?
Actually, I don't worry so much about language preservation or this language endangerment discourse for a simple reason. My position has been very clear. It's a Western discourse, not without, and it's a well-intended discourse. We should be aware of the dangers associated with discourse because it has an agenda behind it. It also has an industrial nexus that is not available for us to see. It is something to feel and something to analyze. That's number one. Number two, across Asia Pacific, the regions that I'm more familiar with and the regions where we have been carrying out research and conferences and stuff like that. For example, Northern Australia, right? Northern Australia is a place where the so-called indigenous languages or communities have been pushed down to, right? But interestingly, and the groups may be as small as 100, 50, or even smaller than that, or 300, 200. You would have imagined populations perished. Populations have perished, right? And languages disappear, but that hasn't happened. Read a study by Ruth Singer and some other groups who are also doing study in the some other regions, right? What is that region which borders Russia and other places, right? And all that, a lot, Siberia and other places. The groups have realigned themselves. They have been intermarrying, and each person is multilingual in several of those languages. They have survived. So when we talk about languages, you should, if you're really interested in understanding language on multilingualism, you should collect the bilingual biographies of people, which is what we have done. And we have been doing it over the years, that how in Nagaland, where Nagamis is the contact language for everyday communication, not because of choice, but because of the circumstances which people have adopted, despite the low prestige it carries overtly, despite it has no official status, no recognition whatsoever. And yet that's the one that binds the communities together. Because it is there outside, the community languages are thriving and people are marrying across language groups. So a Mao might marry an Angami might marry an Ao or a Zomi, and so on and so forth. So parents become bilingual, both husband and wife. And when they are bilingual, mothers will use their language with children, and at dinner table, they will use father's language probably. So, and if they have a help, which they have a system of adopting children or something like that, they also speak that language. They also speak the language of the neighborhood. So see how so multilingualism is not something that we have to worry about, or we have to bring in from the above and unnecessarily fear that multilingualism kills diversity. That is because the methodology we are using are grossly inadequate. We lack the methodology of observing language use. You have to be there in and out to actually see. So I think it is there, and it is not conditioned by legislations. In fact, there were so many studies carried out on the after effect of Narmada, right? That dam. And one of the studies which I happen to have reviewed, I'm happy to share that it actually showed how the relocation of so many groups in a one area resulted in new multilingualism. So you have a language of the market, and you have languages of the community, and you have languages to speak to other people. So multilingualism actually grew as a result of it instead of shrinking. We often think that the state languages have a role to play. So every language, so one of the argument that people give is, oh, Hindi dialects or the local speech varieties, Hindi subs in the way our languages are organized, we didn't do it. It is given to us by Linguistic Survey of India that mapped our diversity for the first time. And then census continued that. So it was rationalized in terms of a handful of languages. And then under each were subsumed a number of languages. Now, Hindi happens to subsume like 50 or something like that. But that's a historical reason for that. That Hindustani Hindi we had been reported earlier, way back in the history, and had become the lingua franca across. One should know that there are a lot of available. So the point is that people have no problem in identifying themselves with Hindi, but that doesn't mean they don't even see a difference between their home language and Hindi. But if you change your methodology and make them think in terms of multiple languages and be able to observe, you will see that the home dialects are continuing alongside. Go to Allahabad, go to Banaras, and you see how much of the is mixed in everyday Hindi talk. If you have they will talk to you in Hindi, but you will also hear that, right? They haven't disappeared. You go to Madhya Pradesh anywhere, something like that. So I think we have to change. We haven't really, despite we talk so much about multilingualism, we really haven't evolved a methodology or adopted the right methodology of studying multilingual behavior. That is what my take on this one. So instead of worrying about language endangerment, we should study what kind of how come multilingualism has survived in India despite 300 years of colonization? That is the question we have to ask. And across Southeast Asia, despite the changed political boundaries and political geographies, the pre-colonial multicultural sensitivities haven't disappeared. The same thing has happened in Guyana, which is made up of people from west of Africa, from India, from lots of other places. It hasn't disappeared. Look at Indonesia. Look at Philippines. Look at look at Singapore. Look at Hong Kong. Look at Cambodia. Look at many of these places. So we should not allow ourselves to be camouflaged by direct importation of a model from the West and going by the West thinks that every language which is officially disenfranchised is a potentially endangered language. But you ask yourself, how many languages play a role in public administration in the United States of America or in Europe for that matter? None. It's only one language. Maybe in some parts of Europe, two languages, right? Like French and something like Dutch, but it's only one language. So why this agenda for us? They are not implementing the same policies for themselves. Let them show that they can have 15 immigrant languages play the same role, given the same status as the English in public administration, then we can understand. So we cannot expect them to understand India because that's not, by ideology, they are monolingual. So they think every language should have. So we can't have this justice rights framework brought in to understand that would be the greatest injustice to multilingualism. If we try to say each language should be given, can you run a country? Can you run a country with 5,000 languages where 5,000 languages are given the same official status and same role in public administration? How do you communicate? It's already becoming a headache when some political leaders pass irresponsible statements about languages, about region. So we should, as linguists, we should be very, very careful. And for Maharashtra and Garhwal, wherever you are researching, if you just change your methodology or ask for inputs from me, you might be able to even observe much more than what you have. And talking about Garhwal and Maharashtra, we must understand Garhwal is a very different contact ecology. You have various altitudes at which people live and very different communities live there. That's a contact zone of Tibeto-Burman on the higher altitudes and the Indo-Aryans, and there have been much mobility across the hills. If you go towards Kangra and Kinnaur, there are people who every day routinely cross hills, just wearing the same sandals that you think, oh, you would require special shoes. No, they are used to crossing. So hills and mountains are not a barrier. Rivers are not a barrier. None of these are barriers. People have been constantly crossing across. Jungles are not a barrier either. Maharashtra forms a very interesting zone connected to Madhya Pradesh, which has seen maximum mobility, right? And Marathis have ruled over large part of Madhya Pradesh, right? And so on. So you should know that also. So the mobility footsteps you need to understand in order to talk about language. And don't only confine yourself to language, observe other people, other things also. If you have other members of your team, I don't know. Is this a CIL sponsored project or something like that that you were talking about?
Not exactly, but it's in an NGO. It's in mainly.
NGO, I
Yeah.
see. Yeah. So that's good, right? But so if you invite some sociolinguist or even some good documentation like Gail Kello, for example, one of my former colleagues and a good friend, you might learn a lot more and might be able to make some more observations. They can just, as I told you, my example about Hampi, where they invited me to observe this Mylara field work. They asked me to join and I trained their team. That was a very, very successful field work. They were not linguists. They were not working on language. They were actually folklorists and comparative literature people, but it helped them, right? So that's my take on this. So I would say study practices, understand what's happening to them and the reasons behind it, then talk about what's happening to languages and why. These are inevitable, right? By introducing them into school will not help it. They might actually kill it. There are two factors that I can name that will destroy diversity or affect. That is education, number one, and second is mobility, and you can't control them. Right? Yeah.
Thanks, ma'am.
So please introduce yourself. Where are you from? You say Bangalore.
Yes, I'm from Bangalore. Yeah, our head office is in Bangalore. So we are directly connected with, hope you might heard about SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics.
SIL.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. When you have an opportunity, please do talk to me.
Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah. If there are no further comments, we can close the session.
Thank you. I think we can now move to the closing session. Madam, we have been listening to you for the past 5 lectures since 30th January. I must say that it was very informative and enlightening to all the scholars who are doing research, fieldwork, and studying on society, how human society is taking it. You have started very basically from the concept of what is social linguistics, how we should assess the society, how we should study a society, what factors we should look into, what are the parameters we must have in our mind when we study about the society. You have traversed through the Western concept of social linguistics, how it is taken up in the West, and the studies that have been undertaken there. And then, of course, we came back to the situation in India, how the social linguistic studies have been progressing in India, what are the major studies that have been made, and the societies which have been studied in detail. We have touched upon the languages from the West to the East, to the South, to the North. So it was a very enlightening experience for all of us. And we started from monolingualism to the very complicated cases of multilingualism that we experience now. And a society which have the ethnic studies which are based on societies that we are making, how this multilingualism is contributing to the multilingual aspects of language and how language changes are taking place in each of the languages and how we should account for them. So it was very enlightening. And you have talked about the field research methods, how we should assess the researchers could take up the assessment of the societies, how the linguistic behavior should be assessed, etc. We have gone through that. And I think it was a very enriching experience for all the listeners who have been with us for all the past 5 lectures. Madam, on behalf of ISTR, Dr. J.K. Panikar,
the director, and all the members of the faculty here, we extend our sincere gratitude to you for having such a great undertaking and presenting such a very beautiful lecture for the benefit of all the linguists, I must say, and all those who attended this one in all the platforms. We are extremely thankful to you, madam. At the same time, I should put in a word to all the listeners who are attending this for all the 5 lectures which have been going on here, and all of you might have greatly benefited out of this. That is what I understand. And I must, for the sake of formality, I must thank the director ISDL for having the mentality to organize such a very enlightening speech, and that too from a great person like you, madam. Okay. Thank you very much once again. And we come to the close of the section. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your kind words. And I must thank Professor Panikar and the entire DLA family and the audience for creating this opportunity for me to speak and listening to me. Thank you all very much.